But well, one of the fascinating stories in the book, and again, the book within the book, is there Phil Walden's relationship with Jimmy Carter. Now, remember, I'm a few years younger than David, so I'm on the receiving end of all this stuff, and it was pretty fascinating to understand and just to look back about how these presidential candidates were now wooing the youth culture, because 18-year-olds get the right to vote in what, 71 it is. And, Hunter Thompson is writing glowingly of Jimmy Carter. And I'm a teenager. I read Rolling Stone. And I see, wow, Jimmy Carter's cool. He's quoting Bob Dylan. He's hanging out with the Allman Brothers. Now you have Jerry Brown with Linda Ronstadt and the Eagles. And of course, Gerald Ford gets on the bandwagon, and he has George Harrison to the White House around that time. Of course, you Beatles don't get you reelected, apparently. But it was very interesting on that take about how these presidential candidates were now wooing the youth culture. And again, Carter and Walden went very deep.
Yeah, so Jimmy Carter was the first one to really do this.
Yeah.
And it really was, as you indicated, because of Phil Walden. So Phil Walden was the manager of the Allman Brothers and the owner of Capricorn Records, and a fascinating character, full of contradictions. I mean, I think
Yeah.
most people hear that and understand what a conflict of interest that is.
Sure.
And I go into it in depth in the book. But I mean, Phil ran their booking company, he ran the publishing company, he ran the record company, and he was their manager. He also had his fingers in, I mean, he was their traveler. He owned the travel agency. He had a piece
Yeah.
of merch company. So basically, every place that there was a revenue stream, Phil either owned or was part owner of, and he was the manager negotiating with each of those entities. So it's just a massive, massive conflict of interest. So that's some of the downside of Phil. The upside of Phil is that he was this charismatic guy. He was brilliant in his own way. He was the one who kept the Allman Brothers on the road. He spent $150,000 to $200,000 to going in debt to that much for the first few years before the success of At Fillmore East. So he was a crucial figure. He also had this close relationship with Jimmy Carter when he was the governor of Georgia. And so when Jimmy was going to run for president, he met with Phil. They were, he asked for support, but I think he was thinking more traditional support, give me some money, give me some visibility. But Phil immediately saw the possibility of what he could do here. And he was on his election committee, on this campaign committee, and he put together these bands. It wasn't just the Allman Brothers Band. The Allman Brothers were the biggest fish. I mean, Marshall Tucker Band did things.
Right.
And they, Phil was really in charge of it. He got a friend of his named Tom Beard, who I spoke to in the book, who was a banker in Hilton Head, South Carolina, but it was originally from Georgia, to come back and run it. And they had shows all over the place. So it was not just the Allman Brothers. And it's important to note that Jimmy Carter, as much as he was taking advantage of this situation, also really loved the music. I mean, Jimmy Carter was a real music lover. He loves these guys and this stuff. And the Allman Brothers really liked Jimmy Carter's politics. So, I mean, there, while it was sort of a convenient relationship on both sides, it was also a real relationship. I mean, they really liked each other. Phil Walden and Alex Cooley, who was a great Atlanta promoter, was also very involved in the Carter campaign and helped put on a lot of these events. One of the reasons they were so attracted to him was his racial politics. They were really sick as Southern men of being so associated with these vicious racists. Lester Maddox, who preceded Jimmy Carter as governor, was one of these arch segregationists. He owned a restaurant. He refused to integrate it. I mean, he closed it rather than allow Black people to come eat in his restaurant. And when they tried to have a sit-in at his restaurant, he beat kids with an axe handle. And there was a picture of that was all over the country, Associated Press. And so Georgia became really known for him and for that image, and they hated that. And that's a big part of why they backed Jimmy Carter. It's a big part of why the Allman Brothers backed Jimmy Carter. And you mentioned Jerry Brown. He was the other guy who, as you said, he was dating Linda Ronstadt off and on. He was really tight with David Geffen and other people in the Los Angeles music world. So he had the Eagles and Linda Ronstadt and Jackson Browne and that whole crew. But he got him into the race way, way later than Jimmy Carter. I mean, too late to really make an impact. Jimmy Carter had the advantage of no longer being the governor. Georgia at the time had a one-term limit, so he had finished in 74. Jerry Brown was the governor of California, and he was only, I think he had only been elected in 70. He might have even only taken office in 74. Anyhow, he was new at the job. So it's kind of hard to be the governor of California and be running a national campaign. And so he got in really late. Now, in previous years, up until 72, the a lot of guys didn't really even run in primaries. I mean, the conventions really were like the party leaders would pick the candidate.
Sure.
But that was no longer the case, but partly because of the chaos that had happened in Chicago, partly because of some Watergate reforms. And so there was a real primary, the way we think of it now, where the voters are electing the candidate, and Jimmy Carter just had too big of a lead for Jerry Brown to touch by the time he got in so late. But the two of them together really did change the whole concept of that it was okay to consort with such people and have the support of rock and roll.
Well, it's right. And again, you always see in history, entertainment and politics, right? Politics is show business for ugly people. Back in the Kennedys, right, when they had the Rat Pack, Kennedy and the Rat Pack, and of course,
and then Sammy Davis with Nixon.
Sammy Davis, right, campaigning for Nixon. And you have to think at some point also, rock and roll was not an accepted part of the entertainment world yet. It was happening around the time of Brothers and Sisters. And, to be courted by the governor, who was part of the establishment, these guys were, scruffy hippies in the eyes of the establishment. And now Jimmy Carter was quoting their lyrics. So that had to sweep Greg and the other guys off their feet a little bit.
It really did. And another example of that, you mentioned briefly before Dickie Betts' Highway Call album.
Yes.
While he was recording that at Capricorn Studios in Macon, Jimmy Carter came down for a visit with his wife, Rosalind. And the word got around that was going to happen. And they were all sort of excited. He was still the governor, I believe. And they were expecting, sort of a photo op, and he'd come by and shake hands and take some photos. But he spent like hours there. He sat down in the studio. There's pictures. I have one in the book of him sitting at the control booth with Johnny Sandlin, the producer, with headphones on. He really liked it. He loved the music. And, there's a quote in the book from Peter Conlon, who was the head of Atlanta Live Nation now, but was really involved in the Carter campaign on the music front. And he says, Jimmy Carter was not an opportunist, but he saw an opportunity. And I think that sums it up pretty well.